Well, welcome to everyone this evening. We have a few folks still in the narthex joining the crowd, so I'll talk for a minute or two to allow them a chance to come on down. We are going to be beginning tonight a three-part series. Of course, you know that Jacques Barzun has graciously agreed to be part of our discussion of writers on writing. This will be a three-part series. Next week, Jan Jarber Russell of Texas Monthly fame and in your local paper on Sundays, and as well the author of a biography of Lady Bird Johnson will be joining us next week at this time in this place. And then for our third and final session, we'll be visiting with Robert Flynn, retired professor at Trinity University, and to talk about writing from his perspective. It was 9 years ago that the Soul Center began its programming in this building, in this room, and it happened to be 9/11, 2001. There was some question as to whether or not we should even have a program with those events going on. As you remember, things started about 8:30 in the morning with their TV broadcasts, and at 10 o'clock was that first class session. As it happens, my father was part of the leadership team of that course, and it was a course on spiritual and practical gardening. And we decided that we would hold the course, and amazingly, everybody showed up. All 25 people enrolled in the course came to be part of that program, partly out of a sense of not knowing what else to do, given that we were obviously in very strange, uncharted waters as a country and as a people who just lost several thousand souls. The Soul Center began in that glare and has been representative over 9 years of trying to deal with the hard issues that our world is faced with. But from time to time, we also look at things about the human soul, about art and creativity, and that is what this program today is about. For me, since I was the founding director of the Soul Center, while they've been offering programs here for 9 years, I've actually been on the job for 10. Or at least present for 10 of those. And so tonight actually kind of marks my 10th anniversary. And so for my personal 10th anniversary, I invited my friend, Jacques Barzun, to be part of this program. And to my amazement, he said yes. I stepped down from the Soul Center about 3 years ago with the idea of pursuing a very large nonfiction writing project. I did not, in my wildest dreams, imagine that 2 of those years, the last 2 years, I would be blessed with a friendship with this man, whose biography I'm not going to give you because in this age of Google and handheld internet, you can look it up for yourself as to the amazing accomplishments of Jacques in his life. We are here to talk about writing. We're not going to get much into the nuts and bolts because, for one thing, I know that you want to learn more about this man's amazing life, and we're also going to focus a little bit upon the roots of that life, his childhood and the things that shaped him and have made him, I think, in my own estimation, into the amazing person that he is. But there are 2 superb nuts and bolts books on writing that Jacques has authored. One, Simple and Direct, which there are copies being offered by the Twig this evening, and another one, The Modern Researcher, for the research phase of the writing process. This one co-authored with his colleague Henry Groff at Columbia University. And so these are excellent resources should you be interested in the nuts and bolts, the practical aspects of writing. But as I say, we're going to devote some time this evening to other matters. And of course, when the gentleman that I'm interviewing is 103 years old, there's a lot of life to try to compact into this hour of conversation. I did want to recognize one person in particular, and that is Marguerite Barzun, Jacques' wife. If you would stand up, please. And we can't do any of this without her, so she deserves a round of applause, that's for sure. Let's see, Christian, have you turned on his? Thank you very much. So to begin, Jacques, we are all of us writers, but you happen to be a professional writer, which is a very rare and special thing. This activity we call writing, what does it mean to you, and in what ways has it brought joy to your life?
A professional writer is really no different from many other people that we know under different names. Novelist, playwright, essayist, columnist in a newspaper. Nowadays, with the public school open to all, the flood of writers has tripled in size, and everybody is an incipient user of the language for exposition, for drama, for every kind of purpose. The only portion of our population that seems to have escaped that is the military, where I am told that 1/5 of those who qualify under that name not only can't write or don't write, but can hardly read and need the comics to help them fulfill their engagements. The comics is a curious substitute for a printed book, don't you think? Yeah. But there are apparently a great many people who, a great many proportionately to the total population, who can only grasp ideas foreign to themselves by reading comic strips. That has always seemed to me very odd indeed, particularly since I think that many of those strips are bad drawing and rather highbrow words put in the mouth of these unsavory characters. What is your experience with the comics?
Well, now let's see now. I have never turned to the comics page to be a, shall we say, a way of finding out more about the world. So I'm not a frequent visitor to it.
I think Family Circus is very good.
You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely right, because they're talking about real life.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
And the characters, little boys and their parents, are engaging.
Indeed.
And so that's one exception to the rule. There always is one if you can only find it.
I do have a question that I want to ask you, and I'll turn to the next slide that we have up here for you. Let's see, there we go. There is a framed picture on the door to your study at home. And it depicts not an individual, not a picture in that sense, but actually a page of a proof, a manuscript proof by Balzac.
Yes.
And we have the image up here, and in the handouts you also will see a copy of that. And it's a fascinating image, and indeed you have one of your books, you actually depicted it and redepict it in the book on writing, as a matter of fact. A printer would be expecting a little bit of marginalia, edits and things that the author would provide. Balzac basically takes that printer page and converts it into a redraft of at least several different versions, which would drive a printer nuts, I'm sure. You have this on the door to your study, which tells me a great deal about what you think about the writing process. And in fact, in the conversation that we've had, you've told me that we shouldn't call it writing, we should call it rewriting.
That's right. Any writing with any pretension to interest other people should be carefully put together, all duplications of ideas removed, a great deal of work. And the Balzac extract points that out without a word and does something else, namely that in his day, printing was very cheap, and he could take a proof and change it. If you did that now, your publisher would hire a hitman and get rid of you as one of its writers, because in fact it's very annoying to cut down costs. Many publishers hire an editorial assistant who goes over the works of writers, established writers, and does a great deal of cleaning up of grammar, punctuation, and everything else, so that it has become almost a regular thing that you fight the editor at your publishing house by restoring what you want. And she is usually a recent girl graduate from one of the Eastern colleges, so that her taste in literature would seem to be rather limited. Anyway, she's...
You seem to speak from experience.
She's entrusted with this power, and it can be sometimes very, how shall I say, unimaginative, and not realize that here's a published author, brought out many books, and he really doesn't need or will not want my emendations.
I want to read an excerpt, a brief paragraph to you and ask your comment. In July of 1954, in your opening paragraph of a book review on Virginia Woolf's A Writer's Diary, you observed the following: "What we ask of a writer in the first place is a unique voice." Let me repeat that. What we ask of a writer in the first place is a unique voice. We ask for the rest later, and we may even pretend that it is only the later things we require. No personal, individual, induplicable quality, just pure art. But that this is pretense appears from our readiness to say, apropos of even the most ancient and most classical author, that some modern translator or interpreter has failed to catch his tone. That passage has really struck me because of the words voice and tone. They suggest a keen importance of an oral quality to writing, to the process of reading and writing and that interplay. What are your thoughts on this?
I've been told, I don't know, the direct experience, that writers fall into two categories: those who hear what they write while writing, and those who simply use words as counters in a game that they've learned to play. And putting it that way is not very complimentary, but I think it makes a difference. What is very strange, really, is that writing, the simple act of writing, and using the words that everybody uses on the street and at home, can have a collective tone, a voice. But certainly, if you think of a story by Kipling, And a story by the late Henry James, you can see that the same English language is two entirely different kinds of performance.
It seems that an author, a writer to engage an audience needs two critical things. That person needs a voice of their own, which is recognizable
Yes.
and which you respond to, and also passion for what they're writing about.
Well, I suppose that the voice conveys the passion, or passion activates the voice. They're not separate. That is, you can't. How shall I put it? You cannot have a recognizable voice and a distinctive one without passion, without seeing in the words more than the surface and more than the meaning perhaps that the ordinary person would have.
Yes. That's very interesting, because I was thinking of them as being sort of different pieces to the puzzle, but what you're suggesting is that they are inextricably linked.
Yes.
And that the technician is just that, merely a technician, when they do not have the passion conveyed, which is not that they can't write, it's that they haven't been able to figure out a way to present themselves on the page. Is that not right?
And isn't it strange that the words that we all use every day can take all these various connotations or secondary resonances in one's head?
Indeed. I have another excerpt that I'm going to read aloud. This is taken from the packet that you have. There is a reprinted, one-page reprint from the American Scholar, a article that you wrote for them in 1946. And it's on writing books is the subject. And I'm particularly interested in this piece because it is in your home, and it's something that you have on the wall displayed. And indeed, it is a photograph of that very picture on his wall that all of you have in replicated form in front of you. I'm going to actually jump around within that. So imagine I'm condensing all that down into this one paragraph. But this is on the making of books. It is so easy to make what looks like a book by taking notes instead of thought and by following an outline instead of inspiration. ... The result is a marvelous anonymity of tone equaled only by a noble avoidance of risk. Of Montaigne, you then go on to say. Now notice there was a laugh there because you captured that voice, and that's part of my point. There's something about good writing that draws us in, and we actually begin having a dialogue and a conversation in that. You then go on to say of Montaigne, like so many others still readable, he sought chiefly to please himself, setting down his thought eccentrically. My mouth is just not working. Without an outline or a file of cards, despite his love of order, and yet managed somehow to fashion a piece of time-resisting work. Though surrounded by thousands of books, he used precedents as starting points, not as havens of certitude. We who are not yet so enveloped in strife have contracted timidity from another cause. We want to be right. We dread the reader who will pounce upon an error of fact, an unfamiliar thought, a naive sentiment. You conclude of this process, the living speech of a true witness is absent. Are there other thoughts about bookmaking that you'd like to share at this point?
Bookmaking.
Bookmaking, both from the standpoint of writers who are trying to create a book, but the other side of the equation, which is the publishers who manufacture the product.
Yes. Well, publishers are subject to economic pressures that are getting worse all the time. and they are being rescued, so to speak, by all the digital means of putting a book together. And many people have predicted the decline and fall of the book as such, as an object to hold in the hand. You will get the full message of the particular writer through some digital gadget. And there are even publishers who say that they will market a book if you get it printed yourself by these digital means. I don't know quite how it's done, but apparently if you have a text, you can get on the internet and utter abracadabra formula, and lo and behold, you have a printed book. And so the publisher will pick it up and try to sell it.
Is it cheating for a publisher to ask a writer to do a particular subject, or should it come from the writer themselves, or is there a happy medium there?
Many publishers want what they think is going to be a bestseller, so they take one of their writers aside and say, why don't you write about this, that, or the other thing? And if the writer has a weak will, he'll attempt it. If he has any sense, he will say, not all your life.
I think it comes from being impoverished, actually. The reason they're so agreeable to these ideas. Well, let me ask you about your writing process. You shared with me that at times, before you fall asleep at night, you actually compose in your mind. What is your writing process? How do you go about it?
Well, this business of composing in the mind is fairly recent with me. I don't know why. Maybe it's difficulty getting asleep, but it's a method apparently that Gibbon used in writing The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He composed whole sections of chapters in his mind and then wrote them out. That I couldn't do. What I do is to sort out lumps of phrasings and hope that they will cohere, though I never particularly make an effort to recall them when I write. They're there to be used if I happen to think of it. No, I think that all systematic devices for generating good writing are a mistake. It should be possible to deviate from one's compositional ideas without a struggle.
Do you write longhand?
What's that?
Do you write longhand?
Oh, yes.
They have this device called the typewriter. Have you ever used one?
Oh, yes. Yes, certainly.
But I mean, in the composition process of your own writing.
Articles for the press, and a few other things can be done direct on the computer without too much loss. And it's a very curious thing that computer writing is always longer than longhand writing. They say, and it's of such a character that you can't edit it. I don't know whether I'm making myself clear, but for example, if you write longhand, you go over it and over it, and over it maybe 4 times, and then all the rough spots and the excess is cut out. Whereas on the computer, the excess gets blended with the rest, and you can't cut it out. It's very odd.
What was your motivation to begin writing? Why did you start writing in the first place, professionally, I mean? What gave you that desire to do that?
Well, I grew up in France in the middle of the modernist movement. My parents were part of its leadership, and as a child, the house every Saturday afternoon was open to writers from all over Europe and even from South America. So I tended to grow up thinking that writing was the only career. It had a naturalness that nothing else held for me.
Indeed, and as we become more familiar with your upbringing, biography, and so forth, that is the natural conclusion, that it was just an obvious thing for you to be doing. I'm very, very struck at something in looking at the books that you've written, that in 1932, you wrote a book called The French Race.
Yes.
And this would have been one of your earliest publications in book form. Would that be correct?
I had to. At that time, the PhD requirement called on the poor candidate to furnish 200 copies of his dissertation in published book form.
I see.
And
so your first book was self-published? Yeah?
yes.
In a manner of speaking, right?
Yes. I wrote history earlier than that. When I was about 8 years old, I presented my father with a piece of writing which stopped with Joan of Arc. And he said, well, why did you go further? And with great indignation, I said, well, the class has gone beyond Joan of Arc.
Well, I thank you for introducing your childhood, because that's exactly where I wanted to spend a few minutes of time in terms of the life that you had in France, and because it was such a loving environment, and there was so much intellectual support that you received at so early an age. I think it's safe to say that you were a precocious child. You've told me that you began reading slightly before you were 3 years of age. So you were already reading and beginning to chew your teeth on books and things of that nature in a real sense. You also had mentioned to me one time that you and your mother would go out on the streetcars and so forth and traveling about Paris, and you would entertain people by reading the advertisements all about. And here you are, a 3-year-old, and you're sort of regaling the crowd, and that the most fun was when you mispronounced things, and then for people to tell, it's this and it's that. That's being the star of the show, isn't it? You also had told me that your family spent time vacationing in Barcelona, in Spain, and that consequently, by the time you were 3, you had also picked up a good bit of Spanish.
Well, children who play with children of another native tongue pick it up without thinking.
Indeed, and they say it's the best time to expose someone to another language is when they're young, right?
Of course, that makes for a limited vocabulary, but you can add to that later on. I can't speak Spanish anymore, though I did at the age of 3, but I can read it as if.
Yes. And then your family your expanded family lived in Grenoble, where you also had a home, but because of your father's diplomatic service, you and your mother and father were often in Paris.
Oh, yes.
And which creates an interesting circumstance in that your family is mostly in Grenoble, but one thing that you told me, which becomes quite significant, is that it is your great-grandmother on your father's side, correct? Mm-hmm. Who also lives a couple blocks from you in Paris. Tell me about her and her influence on your life.
Well, she was not from Grenoble or that region. She was from Sept. And she was born in 1830. And to me, that seemed to be way back in the Middle Ages, but she was very interesting about it. She would tell me about customs and costumes and events. Events particularly, she was a very good narrative speaker, and I wasn't bored. She knew how to tell a story so a child could both understand and appreciate it. And since she lived just 2 streets away from us, on the way back from school every day, I would stop there, go up to her apartment, receive a little piece of chocolate and a bun, and listen to the history of France a little before 1830, because although she was born at that time, she grew up with all that was being talked about, and from that point on. And it's an ideal way to absorb knowledge of history painlessly.
And my understanding from what you had told me, that you really credited her with your taking up the study of history in college. Does that sound right?
Oh, yes. Well, she was the living historian and created the taste in me for knowing what had happened. She must have been a very good storyteller, because I don't remember ever being bored or thinking to myself, when is she going to stop this line of goods?
Well, I'm just struck by your saying she was a living historian, because that is what you are. And indeed, that passage from Montaigne that you were referring to his virtues, and it seems to me those are your virtues. And
well, they were very flattering. And,
I think you would find agreement here.
I'd like to have that engraved.
Yes, we'll work on that. One other thing about the neighborhood where you lived, Balzac's home, he was deceased by now, but Balzac's home was very nearby. Tell me about running around as a kid in Balzac's home.
It had been made into a kind of museum, not very well kept up, but it had interesting features. It had a great lawn, and the whole was on a hill, and one playing on the lawn with other children could see over miles and miles of the city of Paris. And then there was something that at the time meant very little to me, but later on gave me an insight into Balzac's mind that I cherish. He was always impecunious. He never had enough money for anything. But he had a great taste for paintings. And so what he did was to mark with crayon great big squares, and then he wrote inside, here a Rembrandt, here a Delacroix, here. He furnished his house with paintings reduced to this skeletal form.
You've presented a wonderful segue. Let's see. That's just tell me about this portrait right here.
What about it?
Your mother, right? How did this portrait come about?
The painter Glaise was one of the early Cubists, and this is the third Cubist portrait ever painted. Not that it looks exactly like my mother. In fact, many of the features are utterly different. But Glaise was a friend of the family, and he said to my father, I want to paint you for my collection of distinguished men or some such thing. And my father said, I haven't the time to do any sitting. So why don't you paint my wife? Which he proceeded to do, and this is the result. Now, why her hair, which was a light chestnut color, it turns out black here, and her nose has a bulb in it when she had a nice thin nose from beginning to end, and why the hands are not finished. It's all a mystery, but it's a great painting just the same.
And again, this is the third Cubist painting ever painted. That says a lot about your family's presence in the avant-garde community of Paris.
Yes.
Doesn't it? Yes. Tell me, how did you learn to tell time? How did you learn to tell time? You told me that there was a friend who came to these salon visits, these salon gatherings at your home on Saturdays. There was a friend who taught you about time.
Oh, Guillaume Apollinaire.
Yes.
I see. You mean how to read a watch?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, that is what I mean.
Yeah.
You got to remember they didn't have watches like we think of them at that time, so this is completely new. Go ahead.
He had a great big egg, potato of a watch, and in the gatherings at our apartment every Saturday, he was one of the regulars, and one day he said, can you read a watch? And I said, no. He said, well, come on. So he found a chair, put me on his lap, and gave me a lesson. And he said, now run away. So I ran away, and about an hour later, he said, I want to talk to you. He said, here's a watch. How do you read the watch? And apparently I passed the exam, for he remained a friend.
When you told me that story, you concluded by saying you said to him, may I have it?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I wanted it.
It's interesting, this idea of wanting more once you've been exposed to it. You told me a story about, it was one of the operas that you went to.
Carmen?
Yes, it was Carmen, yes. To tell us that story about your going to Carmen. Do you remember it?
Yeah, oh yes. I was greatly moved and declared that I wanted to see a lot of other operas. But in those days, Carmen was almost labeled as the opera to take children to.
I see, yes.
Isn't that odd? It's not
yes.
a very moral story.
Tell me about, there was so much music in your household, and of course, music was played instrumentally in the home in a way that's not today. You were taught by your father how to play a flute, and
yes.
Then at the age of 5, he suggested more formal studies in the flute. What transpired?
solfa?
Well, who was your instructor for the flute when your father decided? Yes, your formal studies.
Flutist from the opera, the first flute of the Paris Opera, and he had very definite ideas. And he said, for one thing, we're not going to play this silver flute which your parents have provided. We're going to start with this. And he pulled out a wooden flute, which has open holes, and which I found my fingers inadequate to shutting up. So I argued with him, and after a while he said, all right, you play one time on my wooden flute and the next time on your silver one. And that's how I learned to play the flute. My father played the flute extremely well. Chamber music was one of the entertainments in the house, and he stood by and let me be victimized in that way.
As you grew and attended primary school and so forth, you learned to speak Latin, and you mentioned that there was a club in which you would twice a week go to the club for speaking Latin,
Yes.
and would literally speak Latin to one another, and only Latin the entire time you were in the class. And then you added to that Greek, so you were having a tremendous formal education to go with this outstanding informal education.
The French lycée was a very thorough kind of educational institution. You couldn't stay in it unless you worked very hard. You went for 2 sessions, 9 to 12 and 1 to 4, which is rather more than now is required in any country that I know. And it was occasionally burdensome, but at other times quite agitating, because the teachers were real teachers and knew how to instill the knowledge that they had into your head. They didn't just stand there and let it flow out without making sure that you got it.
And then you told me that your father sent you to England to learn English in a more formal setting of someone's home, and
Yes.
both the formal and informalities, and that the Gulliver's Travels by Swift was a major text in your training of the English language like that.
Yes, it was planned that I should spend this time learning English in England before coming to America, because I had decided that after the French lycée, I didn't want to go to Oxford, but to New York, Columbia University. And the reason for that was that I got various booklets and derived some of the impression that not only would Columbia University be a very interesting place to be, but there would be Indians around shooting arrows, and I thought that was great fun too.
You come to study at Columbia, and you become a scholar there, and they ultimately hire you to teach history there. This field of cultural history was something new at that time, relatively speaking. What does the work of a cultural historian entail, and why did it attract you?
the two kinds of history that were commonly taught all over the United States at that time were political history and social history, with an occasional course in diplomatic history available to students. But it struck me, and it struck others about the same time, that social history was rather empty and suddenly dry, because society not only has social function, but it's not separable from a culture. So with a great deal of tugging at the coattails of the dean, the heads of departments, some of us got a chance to do some cultural history. And people said, well, what are the limits? What are the boundaries? Political history, you can tell exactly what it is. Social history is also definable. But cultural history is open to everything. And as we said, that is exactly the point.
Because of your presence at Columbia University, and as you caught the eye of people as a rising star, you were invited to lead a program entitled Invitations to Learning, which was a 2-hour formatted, no commercial interruption program each Sunday, in which you and several guests of you, I assume you're choosing, sat around a table and talked about the issues and importance to themselves and to their thinking, to the broader community. Tell, how did that come about, this Invitation to Learning program?
CBS, which I think still exists, doesn't it?
I think so, yeah. Yes.
At that time was headed by a man whose name I've stupidly forgotten because
Mr.
we
Palin.
were...
Mr. Palin. William Palin?
Yes.
Yes.
And he thought that CBS ought to do something for the public good instead of just being a money-making affair of which he was a beneficiary. So he got several of us together to discuss what could be done to advertise CBS in a genteel manner and also useful to the public. So we put our heads together and came up with the idea of having a 2-hour Invitation to Learning session. It was really a, how shall I say, not a carbon copy, but a copy from a program that existed before, of which Clifton Fanaman was the chairman, which was a discussion by invited guests as to knowledge of all kinds. We weren't interested in extracting knowledge, we wanted to provide it. And so we adapted, we turned the program inside out and had people come to us to contribute knowledge, not to quiz. It wasn't a quiz show at all.
And of course, quiz shows were very popular in that day and time, or were moneymakers for the big networks.
Yes.
But yours was a true intellectual discussion among people such as who were the type of Alan Tate, the critic and poet, correct?
Yes.
I'm blanking on his name, the Englishman, Bertrand Russell.
Bertrand Russell.
And I mean, it's just, to be able to keep up with these people and the minds, the intellects around this table, and you were basically running this discussion in the way someone might run a poker game.
Yes. CBS discovered that the listeners amounted to 11 million people, and his subordinates at CBS said, we can't afford to put all that money and effort into serving 11 million people. And what's his name? I've forgotten again.
William Paley.
Paley said, why not? And they said, well, it'll come out of your profits. He said, well, that's what I'm telling you.
Take it out of the profits. Well, where are the William Paleys of today, I wonder? Yes, indeed. Let me also ask, let me make one point, but you made many works and translations, taking classic French texts and presenting them to an English audience. How did that come about? Because by 1956, you had presented at least 8 works in translation of your work. How did that process come out for you?
You mean, were the translations well reviewed, or what are you after?
Well, I guess in looking at the biographies that the publishers were presenting in your books over time, they make this list of works in translation that you had provided, presumably. Mm-hmm. How does that process work for you? Do they come to you and ask you to?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yes.
No. There's an organization in New York that provides texts of plays.
I see.
And they're usually in translation, or a good many are in translation. They also provide English and American plays in those languages, but they try to do something for the other languages. And I think they came to me and said, will you translate Beck's La Parisienne? So that started me. And I enjoyed translation, feeling, I think, a bit vainglorious that I knew both languages equally well, yes. Which is not always the case with translators.
Could you tell us a little bit about the reader's subscription and these 2 gentlemen who are in this photograph behind us, Lionel Trilling and W.H. Auden? How did the reader's subscription come about?
Let's see. It started as a highbrow book club at the instigation of a man who I see right in front of my eyes. I've forgotten the name of. Anyway, that was the day of book clubs, and he thought that he could gather together a large number of readers. We attained 40,000 at one point, who would subscribe to a certain number of books every year with a choice within them. I don't know quite how the scheme worked. And anyway, it was a way of marketing books on a big scale. The club put a lower price on the book than the publishers did. And to give this club publicity, he had the idea of having us read books and discuss them once a week.
And what's so stunning to me about that is that this is the three of you essentially reading what's available in publication and deciding amongst yourselves what books we will offer the public, and then we all subscribe to this. And then in addition, we get a monthly newsletter in which one of the three of you is presenting a book review or perhaps other things.
Yes.
You did not just keep this up for a year or two or three. This went on for 10 and a half, or 11 and a half years. Is that not correct?
Mm-hmm.
The three of you sitting around a table like that, arguing, and there's even a wonderful little anecdote in a book on this subject that David Middleton loaned to me about how having to go through the galleys together and how onerous a process that was in a day when the galleys were these physical, huge, monstrous things that you had to pack up in suitcases virtually, and which didn't have page numbers on them. So how you could sit there and figure out and argue that this needs to be corrected on this page, and among the three of you, it's a fantastic, when you think about it, achievement for three intellectuals and writers of different backgrounds to come together around a table and to do this for 11 and a half years. It's just utterly remarkable, is it not?
Really?
Yes, is it not?
It didn't seem so at the time. And it was a very pleasant sort of afternoon tea. And in fact, we did drink tea, except that in Auden's teapot, there was whiskey.
Well, it was very, very clear that the three of you enjoyed one another's company terribly well. And that it's easy to see why this relationship lasted so long between the three of you, because you clearly felt deeply affectionate to each. And it showed.
We got along very well. There
Yes.
was no rivalry of any kind, because we were all in different fields, and because we were decent citizens too.
Yes. One reason why I wanted to talk a little bit about your music background, growing up with your parents and in the home, was because you were world famous as a champion of Hector Berlioz. And indeed, you've written some masterworks and also have translated his works and his letters. How did this interest in Berlioz, where did that come from amongst all of the greats of music in France that you could have chosen?
Well, when I was quite young, 3 years old, my parents subscribed to a Saturday afternoon concert for children, given in a nice, cozy setting, an auditorium, and I heard selections from Berlioz there, because the man who ran these concerts for children, he was also a conductor during the rest of the week, conductor of a real orchestra. But he had a sort of cut-down orchestra, and he explained what was going on before playing. And I decided that that was the kind of thing I wanted to hear more of, because he wouldn't play complete works, he would play one movement. And I remember my favorites were the Pilgrim's March from Harold in Italy by Berlioz, and the Hall of the Mountain King in Grier's Peer Gynt.
Let me also ask you about your lifetime fascination with mystery and crime writing. You have told me, and you told me very reluctantly, that you actually have authored mysteries and crimes dramas of your own, and you said they weren't that good, but you wrote several of them, so I thought that was quite an accomplishment.
Part of the hack work that I did during my early 20s was that kind of thing. The magazines, the pulps, which printed this stuff and paid, a pittance for, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I know it was not equal to the genius that I poured into these things. It was a genre having its highest vogue and quality in the 20s.
And you've also been a copious letter writer in terms of keeping up relationships by means of letters.
Yes.
And one of those correspondences of yours was to tell the story about how this book here came into being.
Oh.
A catalog of crime.
I had a good friend in our college years. He was at Princeton, I was at Columbia, and we were both very much interested in crime fiction. And we began by telephoning each other fairly regularly, and would mention in that telephone conversation, I recommend so-and-so, which I've just read. That developed into a simpler method of making out a little slip, 3x5, with a Carmen copy, and each of us would send the Carmen to the other fellow, and therefore developed quite a gathering of good crime stories, and also some negative reviews on those little slips. And one day I happened to mention this habit of ours to Joan Kahn, who was the editor of crime fiction at HarperCollins. And she said, well, show me some of these entries. And she had at the back of her mind what she finally came out with, which was, we've got to publish this. And both Wendell Taylor and I said, oh, Lord, that means going over all those slips and putting in punctuation and correcting.
And there's something like 5,000 of these slips, correct?
That's right. 5,000 slips. But then we've had 3 editions of those.
And for that amazing gift to crime and mystery writers across the United States and readers worldwide, this little statuette arrived to your doorstep one day. Could you tell us about this statuette of Poe that you have?
Oh, Mystery Writers of America was an association of writers of mystery stories which awarded a prize every year, I think, to what the group considered the very best of its kind. And after many years, they latched on to the fact that I was doing some reviewing of such crime fiction, and they came around and said, how would you like to be honored with our statuette? I said, what statuette? He said, Edgar Allan Poe, who was really the founder of the crime story.
I think oftentimes in biographies, Dawn to Decadence is your masterwork, as the quote usually appears. I assume that much of this came about through your teaching and study over the course of 90 years of life. Tell us how Dawn to Decadence came into being for you.
I don't remember what started it off, but at any rate, I felt that the history of the last 500 years needed some sort of judgmental records, taking in all that could possibly belong under the heading of cultural, political, social, intellectual, religious history. So I started off with a few pages, a few sheets of this sort of thing, and I showed them to somebody, two or three of my friends. I don't remember who they were. And they said, yes, you've got to go on with it because your conception of those 500 years is not commonly held, and it happens to be very sound. So I plugged ahead. It was very tiresome at times. But then I was, how shall I say, I was encouraged by the form that I found I needed to fulfill in order to not to make the work tedious. That is to say, I had a lot of added on quotations from writers all the way through those 5 years. I also divided the 500 years into groups with cross sections, which meant that instead of carrying on the narrative, I would describe in a particular year what was happening all over Europe and America. And that innovation unnerved me to go through with it, which I did. And I finished the book here in San Antonio.
Were you at all surprised by its bestseller status?
By what?
By its bestseller status, did you?
Oh yes, of course. And I'd had a bestseller, a teacher in America, but it was not a book I was ever particularly keen about because, in my view, teaching is a dreadful profession. It's taking people's minds and stuffing them with tired contents of your own.
And you've won teaching awards, too. By the way, our good friends at the Twig happened to tell me that at the time when Dawn to Decadence came out, the Harry Potter series was getting very, very big. And you were actually in a competition, at least in terms of their supplying of books, between Harry Potter on the one hand, that massive tome of 700 pages, and your massive tome of 700 pages. And the Twig people told me you won. We certainly could go on and on with this, but we will not, as I'm sure you will be happy to know, because you have exerted much energy and been very gracious in sharing your time with us today.
Well, I was flattered to be asked, and I thank you.
Just one second. Would you just tell me about this painting behind us?
The portrait. I had a friend named Cecil Gray who was commissioned by somebody to make a portrait of me for Newberry Museum in Westchester County, somewhere up there. And did some sitting, and The result was quite satisfactory. But I said to him, you know, you made me look much better than I am or feel, and I wish you would do a caricature. And he said, oh no, I don't do caricatures, but I'll do you in a rather different mode and mood. And this is the result.
Yeah, you told me when we visited about this that you afterwards asked him, why is one half dark and the other half bright? And Gray joked, half is what you want and the other half is the way I wanted it. The inimitable Jacques Barzun. You're welcome to stay, to visit with the Texas Public Radio and the Twig, and we have refreshments as well for you. And we hope you'll come back next week with Jan Jarbo Russell and some Texas politics.